The extensive flight testing of aircraft at Wright Field by the Flight Test Section of Engineering and Procurement Division has been and will continue to be of vital importance to the Air Force's program of development, production, and modification of airplanes and aircraft equipment. The work of the accredited test pilot is not just a simple job of flying. The men selected for this work must meet certain specifications for an engineering background and adequate flying record. Picked men go through a rigid period of training and apprenticeship before reaching the top test pilot status. From the very first, they must understand that the serious business of flight testing is at all times a technically accurate procedure, frequently dull and unexciting. This film will familiarize new test pilot trainees with the course of training and procedure for flight test pilots at Wright Field. No textbooks have ever been published on flight test training, and success in this field depends largely upon the individual. The knowledge the pilot absorbs will be gained the hard way over a period of 6 to 18 months. In testing fighters, he'll spend many hours sweating it out alone. In larger aircraft, someone who can help him find the answers will fly along with him. He may be a pilot, returned from several hundred hours in combat, or he may be a flight test engineer who requires the test pilot's cooperation and judgment. In developing aids to flying, no one has brought forth a pilot with an extra pair of hands, which accounts for the need of a second man during a complicated test procedure. Flight testing means thoroughness, more often thoroughness at its dullest, thoroughness that takes hours of precision flying. The many dull hours spent in sweating out tests are partly compensated for by the variety of tests and the many types of airplanes to be flown. Down in this southwest corner of Ohio is located without a doubt the most unusual air center in the world, Wright Field. Here he will find the widest and oddest assortment of aircraft ever assembled on one airfield. A pilot's flying time in one or two types of aircraft is of little consequence here, for he becomes a real asset to the flight test section only after he has become familiar with all types. The judgment of a top-ranking test pilot often becomes the basis for important decisions in development, modification, and production. Many top names in the industry today were associated with earlier flight tests that helped make America the world's top-ranking air power. The flight testing of modified aircraft, too, ranging from the odd combination of a B-17 nose applied to a B-24 to a lopsided cockpit added to a P-38, is all in a day's work for the flight test pilot. Whether it's the largest of bombers or the smallest of experimental fighters, each airplane must be flight tested, all of which emphasizes the important role the flight test pilot plays in the development and acceptance of aircraft and equipment by the Air Forces. Such an enviable rating may seem a remote possibility to a lieutenant fresh out of flying school and about to take off on a flight test training course. To illustrate the various steps he must take, this chart outlines his progress from the start. His initial classification will normally be that of functional pilot. Assigned to the less involved tests, he will become acquainted with many types of airplanes, developments, and modifications. If he can stick this out, he will advance to the training bracket. The limited flight test grade widens his experience in many types of airplanes, during which he will learn how to sweat out his tests. His chances are somewhat less, of course, in becoming one of this group of test pilots, whose judgments and decisions are so important in any one or all of the branches, bomber, fighter, or training and transport, under the flight section of engineering and procurement. Much of the flight testing is conducted upon recommendation from theaters of operations. Tests that have to do with modifications or development. These are requested by Air Technical Service Command Headquarters. However, the majority of tests are requested by production engineering, the technical staff of Engineering Division, and the many Wright Field laboratories. Aside from performance or flight tests, there are many incidental tests. For instance, any factory or laboratory data on piston rings, after having been run in on a block test, cannot include the variables that will show up under flying conditions. The result of high temperature or wear from sand and dust do show up when flight tests are made here or at some desert air base. And again, when the size of an oil radiator is found to cause considerable drag, hot oil tests are conducted. These will determine if the size of the radiator can be reduced to increase airspeed without causing engine failure or reducing engine efficiency. Developments on landing gears require landing and taxi tests to find out their effectiveness in snow, sand, and mud. Such tests are usually jobs for the unseasoned pilot. But when he has shown that he can take long hours, 7 days a week, and an intense interest in his assignments, he will be advanced according to his abilities. When considered competent, he will then be assigned to an aircraft to get performance data. Prior to all tests, a flight test engineer contacts the source of the request personally and determines in detail the specific information desired. It is he who checks the assignment of the airplane to be flown and sees to it that it is properly loaded and equipped for the test. Now our flight test pilot comes into the picture. He and the engineer become a Ways and Means Committee to determine the best procedure for the test. Of these ways and means, the type and weight of the airplane is considered, the fuel capacity, type of instrumentation, and the pilot's endurance. Several data cards will be needed, one for each test. On each card is outlined the flight test procedure for that particular kind of flight test. Records of each test are to be entered by the flight test pilot on his data card clipped to a holder on his knee. The use of a stopwatch computes his timing. Then, to obviate the chance of human error during some tests, two devices automatically record other desired readings. The barograph, which from takeoff to landing traces a record on its blackened paper cylinder, and a fixed movie camera driven by a spring motor. This is focused on an auxiliary instrument panel and will photograph steadily or intermittently the readings of the instruments during the test period. The test records of these two devices are used singly or compared with each other and the pilot's data card. Since the answers to all tests are based on a correct airspeed calibration and altimeter check, this becomes the first of all tests. Having obtained from the flight test laboratory a barograph, stopwatch, and camera if a photographic record is to be made, the procedure is now up to the pilot, providing the weather conditions are favorable. In this case, low wind and smooth air at low altitude, since several runs are to be made over a speed course. Before takeoff, the altimeter is set at 2992. The altimeter reading and free air temperature are then noted on the data card. When the speed course is reached, it is traversed at the approved low altitude and slow speed. This is done in order to make another check on the altimeter and temperature in this locality. Remember, these readings are always taken before takeoff, before and after the actual calibration, and again after landing back at Wright Field, because it is these figures that enable the flight test engineer to compute the airspeed installation error. The effect of a crosswind must now be considered. An effective run can only be made by disregarding drift and flying the airplane on the compass heading of the speed course. Now for the first half of the first calibration run. Having gone back far enough to attain maximum speed well before reaching the marked course, the stopwatch is started opposite the first set of markers. The indicated airspeed, the altimeter, and free air temperature are noted, and the watch stopped in passing the last markers. All this information is now entered on the data card. Returning for the last half of this first run at the same speed, the same procedure of clocking, reading, and entering is repeated. Other complete runs at lower speeds are made and the recording procedure repeated, not overlooking that final altimeter and temperature check at the speed course, and again before you step down from your airplane on the ramp at Wright Field. Remembering that you've been out for an hour and a quarter, there's probably a change in both barometric pressure and temperature. Obviously, there has been a change, and now the flight test engineer can compute to his heart's content. An alternative procedure in obtaining airspeed calibration is frequently used in which another airplane is employed instead of a speed course. This additional aircraft is kept up to accurate calibration and functions as a pacer airplane during the test. The various check Intervals are signaled visually from one pilot to the other. In this procedure, the altimeter checks at various speeds are made by buzzing the tower both before and after the test. This is not the fun it seems to be. It's a job of precision flying. Then someday, when the weather is just right, you'll be running a critical altitude flight test. In other words, finding the highest altitude at which rated power can be obtained on this airplane and recording the necessary data. You will recall your session with the flight test engineer when together you decided that for this test you would make 5 level flight runs at altitudes that would produce the needed data. Functional settings during the run must include the prop at 3,000, mixture auto-rich, throttle wide open, flaps completely closed, and landing gear up, not overlooking the necessity of setting your altimeter at 2992 before takeoff. During the climb, readings are taken at each test altitude of the free air temperature at an airspeed of 120 miles per hour. Then getting above the top test altitude with the prop set at 3,000, mixture auto-rich, and throttle wide open, the run is started at exactly 19,000 and held there until a completely stabilized condition is reached. That precise condition will not be arrived at, however, until you've learned the meaning of sweating it out. That's what you came up here for, to hold her until you could get accurate readings for the flight test engineer. Indicated airspeed, manifold pressure, carburetor air temp, oil temp, and cylinder head or coolant temp. With these few little details entered on the data card, you can drop down to 18,000 and do it all over again. Then down to the other levels specified on your data card, at each level repeating the same procedure of reading and entering. Maybe not quite as fast as the action of this graph, for the actual test flight takes about an hour and a half of precision flying. With this test completed, maybe you can call it a day if your data card is complete with the date, time of test, and your somewhat shaky signature. After the flight test engineer has computed your data to determine the critical altitude, we come to the test for power calibration and high speed points, or to find the best airspeed for various engine settings. Since the desired altitude is unknown and varies from day to day, a density altitude table is used to find the altitude at which this test is to be run. Again, the altimeter is set before takeoff, 2992. Then a search for the altitude where your air temp and altimeter readings agree with the matching combination shown on the density altitude table. When this altitude is found, again as in the previous test, the prop setting must be at 3,000, mixture auto-rich, throttle wide, cowl flaps closed, wing flaps and landing gear up, and the run proceeds exactly as in the critical altitude test. A short pull-up identifies the end of each run on the barograph record. The second run is made with procedure unchanged, except that the throttle is pulled back to a point that will reduce the manifold pressure 2 inches. For each succeeding run, the throttle is pulled back for an additional 2-inch reduction of the manifold pressure, and entries are made of these important readings on the data card. All runs completed, we now have the necessary high speed points in relation to manifold pressures. This data is then reduced by the flight test engineer to a curve, representing the variation of speed with power at the critical altitude. Consequently, with the rated power of the engine at critical altitude, the curve shows us the maximum speed of the airplane. Now that we have covered the test procedures for all level flight performance, here are the tests to ascertain the most efficient climbing speeds and the best rate of climb. In order to determine the indicated airspeed for maximum rate of climb, a series of short climbs are made through an altitude range agreed upon by you and the flight test engineer. In this test, the barograph for the first time becomes a primary instrument. The stopwatch is again used. And as in all test procedures, the altimeter setting is important. Again, a check is made as before, from prop setting to landing gear. In this test, the coolant flaps and oil shutters are set wide open. Care must be taken in flying this test to make certain the airplane is in a steady climb at the indicated airspeed specified on the data card before the desired lower altitude is reached. This specified airspeed must be maintained to a point at least 500 feet above the predetermined altitude range. Upon reaching the range, the stopwatch is started. Midway, the manifold pressure and carburetor temp are noted and entered on the data card. When the top altitude is reached, the watch is stopped. Then the time is entered on the data card and the watch is reset at 0. After continuing the climb to 500 feet above, you can then drop down below the bottom of the range far enough to again reach a steady climb before re-entering the testing altitudes. If the air has not been perfectly smooth during this first climb, the test should be discontinued. But assuming that it was smooth, the second climb is made, holding steadily to the next indicated airspeed on the card and the readings entered as in the first run. These sawtooth climbs are continued until all the indicated airspeeds for the test have been covered. On any one of your descents, when midway of the range, a free air temp reading should be taken at slow speed. Your card will now have all the desired data, and you will also have a barograph record of every climb. When this record has been calibrated in the flight test laboratory, your engineer checks it against the readings you entered on your data card. Since the most efficient climbing speed varies with the altitude at which the test was run, other similar tests are made at various altitudes in order to find the best climbing speed at any altitude. Once these speeds are determined, we can proceed to the next test, the check climb. There are several ways of finding rate of climb and time required in climbing, but a continuous climb to as high as the airplane will go will get the best answers within a reasonable amount of flying time. Before starting this test, if clouds are noted at 10,000 feet, better postpone it, for smooth air is essential. Assuming that it looks favorable, let's make a try for it. After the flight test engineer has specified on this data card the best indicated airspeeds resulting from the previous sawtooth climbs, the pilot needs for this test, along with the barograph, a different type of stopwatch. Having two hands, it measures two time periods. Once the barograph is caged and started, the altimeter is set at 2992. Again, as in the sawtooth climb, all the specified settings from prop at 3000 to landing gear up are checked. Then, slowing the airplane down to the specified airspeed at as low an altitude as possible, the throttle is advanced to the proper setting, specified on the card, and the airplane pulled up into a climb, keeping the airspeed constant. From here on, the airspeeds must check exactly with those speeds called for on the card. The split-hand stopwatch is started at the first even altitude after stabilized climb is attained. At this altitude, readings are taken of the manifold pressure, cooling flap position, and carburetor air temp. At the next even altitude, one hand of the watch is stopped. The time noted along with the manifold pressure and other necessary readings as before. The stopped hand of the watch is then brought up to the moving hand. This procedure is repeated at every even altitude, all the way to the top of the climb. The top is reached only when the rate of climb drops below 100 feet per minute. The entries on your data card now show the test completed, except for the free air temp readings at slow speed. These are made at the even altitudes on your way down, taking readings at each altitude at which you took readings during the climb. Because of a probable weather variation at the testing altitudes, and the chance of human error in procedure and readings under such circumstances, the whole bloomin' thing has to be done all over again. After the second test run is made, and not until then, can these barograph tracings, combined with the information on both data cards, form a basis from which the engineer can determine four things: the maximum rate of climb, the minimum time required to climb to any altitude, the service ceiling, and the absolute ceiling of this particular airplane. This covers all level flight and climb tests. These flight tests thus far have found the best climbing speed, the ceiling, the critical altitude, and the top speed of an aircraft. The next and last are the takeoff and landing runs, the most advanced of all flight tests. Owing to the nearness to stalling speed at low altitude, they are also the most dangerous. Good visibility is needed, and the wind must be less than 10 miles per hour. No extra instruments are taken along, for a camera crew on the ground will take a motion picture film record of your takeoffs. They will have noted the wind velocity and direction, barometric pressure, and free air temperature. These and the film will enable the flight test engineer to compute your ground roll, ground speed, and after leaving the runway, your earliest clearance over a possible obstacle. At least 30 minutes before the test is to be run, you will have informed the flight test laboratory. This will allow the camera crew sufficient time to set up their equipment. Their camera must be positioned over a fixed marker located in the center of the field and several hundred yards from the runway you are going to use. Once on the taxi strip, the pilot waits for signals from the camera crew. The brake should be locked and the altimeter set at 2992. The free air temperature is noted and entered on the data card. The cowl flaps must be set, and the data card specifies their proper position. The wing flaps on the B-26 are in best takeoff position when set at 30 degrees. This setting has been arrived at from previous performance takeoffs. Such settings on other airplanes may range from 0 to full down. Also, from previous tests, the pilot remembers that at this gross weight of 31,000 pounds, the B-26's best indicated airspeed for takeoff is 104. That 115 is the best airspeed to clear an imaginary obstacle in the shortest possible distance. Even two memory experts couldn't remember all the readings for this test in the time it takes to make one run. By that we mean the RPM, manifold pressure, indicated airspeed, and carburetor temperature as a group of 4 figures at 3 separate points of the test. So at least 6 runs will have to be made. 2 runs to concentrate on the 4 readings when the brakes are released, 2 more runs to note these correlated figures when the wheels clear the ground, and the last couple of runs to get the 4 readings at the moment you reach 50 feet above the runway. Camera records of 3 of these runs will be selected by the engineer to determine the shortest run necessary to clear a 50-foot obstruction. Your signals from the camera crew are transmitted by a light gun, similar to those used in control tower. These flashes control the procedure throughout the test. When you have lined up the airplane on the runway with brakes firmly applied, you are ready to rev up the engines to the specified power and release the brakes. If they do not hold until this specified power is reached, the power will have to be brought up as quickly as possible after releasing the brakes. The film records, after being analyzed in a viewer, permit the engineer to average a curve showing the best takeoff performance. A simple test, isn't it? On paper. The approved landing tests are made with the same photo recording equipment and under the same weather conditions. When the cameraman is ready, the pilot circling the field will get the green light and line up for a landing. Coming in, when he is 50 feet above the runway, he must quickly note both the indicated airspeed and the RPM. His minimum airspeed should be such that a slight flare will result before his wheels touch. The instant they contact the runway, indicated airspeed and RPM are again noted. Then the brakes will be applied as hard as possible without lifting the tail too high and damaging the prop. To the camera crew, a good landing looks like this. After coming to a full stop, he will have time to write down the instrument reading when at 50 feet up and when he landed. Then he takes off and does it all over again 5 or 6 more times. In the Flight Test Engineering Office, the film records will be translated to a curve showing the minimum distance this airplane needs to land after clearing a 50-foot obstacle. This information is used only by engineers for comparison with other airplane performance. Therefore, it is not recommended for use by the pilot either in training or combat. In testing the handling characteristics of any airplane, such assignments as stability, dive, spin, and aerobatics tests are entrusted to only the most experienced of flight test pilots. More often, it is up to him to judge the results rather than the engineer. You can expect no thrilling exploits, no heroics, no public acclaim. Aside from work well checked by the crew chief, the weatherman, and communications, your life will often depend on your own reactions in an emergency. All flight tests conducted at Wright Field are based on many years of research and the experiences of men having the most comprehensive range of facilities in the world. Someday, when you have mastered the flying characteristics of many types of aircraft, have learned to cooperate with the flight test engineers, to render intelligent suggestions and decisions on design, function, and production, then you may be accepted as one of this group of specialists at Wright Field, known and respected as flight test pilots.